Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to the session where we carry out the discussion for the geography optional paper which has appeared in this year's mains examination, analyze the intricate details associated with that, understand the pattern which UPSC is trying to frame for the candidates, and also understand what needed to be the approach from the candidates in order to answer those questions effectively. We shall be discussing all the questions and briefly talk about that what is required to be written in the answers overall. Now, this year's geography optional paper overall can be termed to be from moderate to slightly difficult, owing to the fact that majority of the questions asked and associated were requiring the candidates to involve multiple different concepts and assimilate those different concepts. So we shall be discussing what are the concepts which are required to be provided in the paper and how is it that you could enrich your answer thereby. Now, this is something that we also hold a regular discussion, and the questions associated with it are also something that we have a regular discussion in the sessions and in our geography optional classes as well. So that is something that you can join with the help of our Telegram group and attend the various discussions and the questions which can be framed. You can also join the geography optional sessions in complete English medium at Unacademy. Use the code MJOPT and avail the maximum discount. Now, having said that, without further ado, let us straight away jump into the discussion of paper 1 and analyze the questions which have been asked thereby. Starting with the first question. Now, the first question had 5 subparts, each of them of a 10 marker. So, the question was, what are truncated spurs? Where and how are they formed? So here the question is about spurs, first of all, to understand what the spurs are and for you to be able to describe that how the spurs become truncated overall. So what do we understand by spurs? So spurs are in a way extended ridgelines, an extension of mountains or mountain ridges, right? So these are what the spurs generally are referred to. So for example, let's suppose in any particular area, you have a mountainous region. Now this mountainous region will have a large ridgeline, let's suppose. Now here, you would have observed that many of these mountainous areas, they have an extension across the ridgeline. Now these extensions that are observed, the finger-like extensions, that are what are referred to as the spurs. For example, you would have come across the events and the border dispute which are happening across the Pangong Tso Lake in the region of Ladakh. Now there you would have come across the terminologies finger 1, finger 2, finger 8, up till finger 4 you have the control of the Indian Armed Forces, etc. So those fingers which are referred to in that particular debate and discussion, those are basically mountainous spurs. So any particular ridgeline if you consider, these extensions, these are the spurs. Now generally, when you consider these spurs are also oftentimes not complete in itself and they are also basically truncated. Many of the times they get eroded up till varying degrees, right? So first of all, you have to mention in the answer what do you understand by spurs, and then you have to talk about how the truncated spurs are created. So these truncated spurs are created due to the glacial erosion. Glacial erosion is the main primary factor and the cause which leads to the formation of these truncated spurs. Now here, just the glacial erosion, how is it that it will lead to the formation or the truncation of the spurs? What is truncated? Truncated basically in its own immediate translation refers to something which has been cut off, something which is not complete, right? So this glacial erosion leads to or carries out a kind of a back wasting, whereby slowly and steadily, let's suppose here you have the glacial movement. Now, as the glacier moves in this direction or any of the direction, slowly and steadily it will carry out the erosion of these spurs by the process of plucking action, right? Plucking is where the rocks are abrased and the rocks are eroded by the glacial action. And as a consequence of that, you have the truncated spurs. So, how are they? First of all, where are they formed? So, these are formed in areas of high altitude, Why? Because that is where you will have the glacial action and the glacial erosion taking place. Now, in very rare cases, you can also have fluvial action being responsible for some of the spurs getting eroded. But the immediate or the exact valley widening, which leads to the spurs actually getting back wasted and reducing in size, that is observed due to the glacial action in itself. Glacial action has got some of the largest force that nature has got to exert. So, here in this answer, first of all, you had to talk about what these spurs are, represent a kind of an image or a diagrammatic representation was required, and then talk about how the glacial action could have led to and does lead to the formation of these truncated spurs. Give the example of the fingers associated with the Pangong Tso Lake. So, there you have the spurs in those particular areas. Some of the spurs indicate back wasting and indicate a feature of truncation. Okay. So, it was a kind of a question. If you are aware about spurs, this is something that you could solve logically as well. Again, something about the spurs we had discussed in the class and discussed in the session itself. And glacial erosion was a natural logical extension of that. Now, formation of temperate cyclone depends on the condition of axis of dilation. Elucidate. Now, here, when we talk about temperate cyclone, or the cyclogenesis in temperate areas, why do we have the formation of temperate cyclones? That is largely due to the interaction of the air masses, isn't it? You have interaction between the air masses. Now, air masses of different characteristics of temperature, of moisture content, of density, when they interact, that is when you will have the formation of a temperate cyclone. So, here let us suppose if you take a top view of any particular region of an air mass, let us suppose we consider the mid-latitudinal areas. That is where, after all, the temperate cyclones are created with greater amount of frequency. So, in these mid-latitudinal areas, let us suppose you have an air mass of one particular characteristic coming from a direction. Let us suppose we consider the polar air mass. And then in the region of mid latitude, you also have the tropical air mass, continental air mass, maritime air mass. Now, they end up moving in the other direction. So, basically, when they will end up converging, there will be a zone of convergence. So, at that zone of convergence, basically the air masses will end up diverging. So, what you observe here is basically the axis of dilation. This is what we refer to as the axis of dilation. Now, this particular axis of dilation, as long as this remains quite prominent, you won't have the generation or the germination of a cyclone. Once this axis of dilation, let's suppose, gets deformed, there is a deformity or deformation, then what happens? In that situation, as it gets deformed, let's suppose its new condition becomes somewhat like this. Only in that case will you have the warmer air mass going into the region of the colder air and the colder air mass coming into the region of warmer air, and that is when you will have a significant or a substantial frontogenesis which can happen. And for the formation of a temperate cyclone, frontogenesis is a very required precondition which needs to be fulfilled. So, as long as the axis of dilation is quite prominent, in that case, when it is prominent, then you will have the formation or the existence of a stationary front. stationary front. And this stationary front is not ideal for any cyclonic formation. So, as long as this axis of dilation is prominent, no temperate cyclone will be created. Only when this axis of dilation will start getting deformed will there be a significant and a considerable convergence, and that is where you will have the formation of a warm and a simultaneous cold front. And that formation of a simultaneous cold and warm front will lead to the creation of a low pressure. That low pressure will intensify as much as convergence will happen, and that is when a full scale and a full blown temperate cyclone starts getting developed. So, that is a factor with regards to the formation. So, here what did you have to write? First of all, you need to mention about the axis of dilation, that what is this axis of dilation. So, it is that zone where the air masses of differing properties, they end up meeting towards each other and there is a divergence which is caused. So, that ends up creating a situation of a stationary front. As long as that prevails, you will never have the formation of a temperate cyclone. Very briefly, only in the schematic diagrammatic representation, you could also talk about the further formation of a temperate cyclone when the deformation of the axis of dilation happens. So, here it is about the temperate cyclone and the cyclogenesis and how that is created and how that is caused. Okay? So, that is what was needed to be written in the answer. Then, with suitable examples, explain the factors causing sea level changes. Now, this is in tune with the questions being asked even in the GS paper with regards to the sea surface temperature rise. Now, when we talk about the sea level changes, now the sea level changes broadly overall can be categorized to be happening because of two reasons. What are those two reasons? One reason is tectonic changes. Now, what do we mean by tectonic changes? Let's suppose there is an upliftment or submergence of land. Due to the eperogenic force, that is due to diastrophism, there is upliftment or submergence of land. That will lead to the level of sea changing in that particular local area. So, this is largely driven by endogenic factors. Endogenic factors. And then the sea level also changes owing to the rise in sea surface temperature. Now, why is there a rise in sea surface temperature? So, this rise in sea surface temperature is caused because of various anthropogenic factors, the natural factors as well. So, overall the rise in sea surface temperature will lead to the sea level change. How? So, here it will have two impacts. One is melting of ice caps and glaciers, and secondly, the factor of thermal expansion. Now, here you could write the detail about it as well, that from the era of almost 1900s to the year or to the decade up till 1990s, thermal expansion has been the major cause for sea level rise, right. So, here 1900 to 1990s. More than 50% of the sea level rise is attributed to the changing conditions or the increased amount of heating leading to the rise in sea level. But after 1990s, what has been experienced is the fact that there has been a large scale melting of ice caps in the polar areas, the glaciers melting, etc., increased river runoff in certain areas. So, that has led to a further sea level rise. So, this is post 1990s. This is the major dominant factor. 1990s. Now, this is something which has been indicated by the WMO report as well, the World Meteorological Report about the oceans. Now, you could highlight that particular report also if you are aware, but that is something that you would have read in your sessions also, in the portion of environment ecology also. This is something that would have been covered. So, here again, it won't have been very difficult. So, here suitable examples you can talk about. For example, tectonic changes have led to, or endogenic factors have led to the change in sea level. There you can even elaborate about the examples in the eastern coastline of India. There the sea level has changed. Eastern coast is also referred to as the emergent coastline, because the land has substantially risen above the sea level. So, that is something that you can highlight. So, like that you can substantiate and elucidate the various reasons associated. So, this is a very easy question. At a GS level, you could also answer this particular question. Then, examine the impacts of social forestry in socio-economic transformation of rural areas. So, when we talk about social forestry, this is about the community forests that you have, agroforests that we have. Now, this agroforestry has got, and social forestry has got multifarious impacts and multifarious benefits associated. So, all those benefits you have to highlight here. So, first of all, what do we mean by social forestry? That is something that could be written easily in the introduction. Now, here the components associated with it, such as agroforestry, agroforests, community forests or the community reserves, all of them, right. Now, how do they lead to the socio-economic transformation? First of all, they give or provide a kind of economic benefit. Economic benefit is associated. Okay? Because of forest produce, you will have a significant amount of benefit from the various different types of fruit trees that you have. Then, for example, the product of the forest that you have, for example, barks, branches, etc., supply of timber, everything can be a benefit. So, there is an immediate economic benefit that has to be ascribed here. Then, other than that, it also provides or creates jobs. Creates jobs, particularly for the woman. Okay. Now, in many of the areas in our country also, it has been experienced that these community forests and these social forests, they have helped and allowed the women to form those self-help groups where they have successfully managed to market the forest produce and earn a meaningful income for their own. So, here the formation of self-help groups, that can be highlighted. Okay. That is something which could be highlighted here. Now, when you have the women being economically empowered, so that is also something leading to emancipation and further empowerment. Okay. So, that is about some of the benefits associated, but then there are long-term benefits in the region as well. For example, when you have the community or the social forest, it increases the water availability in that area. In that entire region, there is a greater amount of water percolation and penetration to the lower levels, increased recharge of the groundwater reservoir, and that virtually means what? There is water sufficiency. Water sufficiency. Now, in many parts of our rural countryside, we have the case where the women folk have still got to go long distances and cover large distances for the availability of water. But then water sufficiency in those areas saves significant amount of manpower, and that can be put to use in productive purposes, and that can also bring about a greater social equality in that region. Then, other than that, better agri-product or better agroecology. You have sustainable cultivation which is carried out, and the health of the ecosystem is also maintained. So, with minimal input, you get substantial and sufficient amount of output as well. So that can also be written. So like that, you have to delve into the various other aspects and the entire socio-economic transformation in the rural region. So you have to concentrate for the women, you have to talk about the marginalized section of the society, they will also end up benefiting, and you also have to diversify into the environmental and the ecological aspect associated. Okay, just focusing only on the economic aspect is not sufficient. That diversification is required. Then, mountain regions are more fragile to ecological changes. Elucidate. Now, this is again a very simple GS based question, that they are more fragile to ecological changes, and here you have to give examples. So, what ecological changes are we talking about? We are talking about various factors such as, let's suppose you have a factor of climate change, climate change is a major factor. So, owing to climate change, you have various events. For example, you have the increased amount of events such as cloudbursts, right? You have events such as GLOFs, they occur. Then you have creation of dry land formation. Then you have increased consequences in the form of landslides and mass movement, like debris fall, flows, earth flow, mud flow, etc. Movements, they become a commonality and a common factor, right? So, all these make the mountainous regions significantly prone to these changes. Now, also owing to the fact that you have the factor of slope, and when you have the slope which becomes unstable, owing to any of these factors of excessive rainfall or sudden flow of the rivers, then that can also basically lead to increased erosion. Then dryland formation can also immediately give rise to, because of the type of vegetation that you have in the mountainous area, it can also give rise to forest fires. Excuse me, something that we observe in the region of Uttarakhand quite frequently. So, these are the factors that you had to focus upon. Again, for this, no extra or detailed information was required. A basic analysis of the trend of the current affairs was sufficient, owing to the fact for the past year, the Himalayan ecosystem has been in lot of news and lot of attention owing to these changes, and the forest fires, GLOFs, etc. have been frequent events and incidents in that region. Then, coming over to the next question. Examine the recent views on mountain building process and divide the world mountains on the basis of their genesis. Now, this was again a simple question, straightforward question, and this could easily be attempted. So, here recent views of mountain building, basically you had to focus upon the plate tectonic theory, the plate tectonics. Now, as per the plate tectonics, mountains can be created due to various different factors. So, first of all, you have to understand what are the various different types of mountains. So, when we talk about the types of mountains based upon their genesis, you have the three types. You have the fold mountains, then you have the presence of block mountains, and also the presence of volcanic mountains. Now, here all of them could be explained by the plate tectonics. Now, here you have to elaborate in significant detail because it is a 20 marker. You have to elaborate in detail about the plate tectonics. Now, in plate tectonics, we know that the formation of mountain is associated with the aspect of convergence, any kind of convergence. So, when you have convergence, for example, when you have the case of, let's suppose, oceanic convergence. Now, this oceanic convergence will always lead to formation of volcanic islands, which are also a kind of a mountainous feature. Right. Many of these underwater mountains or sea mounts eventually, due to continued volcanism, they rise above the sea level as well. Here you could give the example of the subduction of the Pacific plate and also the convergence with the Philippine Sea plate or the Caroline Sea plate. That example could be written, or the oceanic portion of the oceanic margin of the Australian plate converging with the Pacific plate. There also you have underwater sea mounts which are created, and also some of the mountains. So there, oceanic convergence. Then after that, oceanic continental convergence. Here in each one of them, a schematic diagram was required. That what do you mean when you have, or when you depict that convergence will lead to the formation of mountain? How? What do you mean to explain by that? So diagrammatic representation is a must. Now that is something again we have covered in the class in significant detail, so I'm sure you would be able to do that. So here, oceanic continental convergence, what is that about? So in this, for example, take the case of the Nazca plate and the region of the South American plate, formation of Andes, you can give as an example. Then formation of the Cascade ranges in the region around the western part of North America, that could be given as an example. Like that, you could cite multiple examples, and then continental convergence, right? So fold mountains are created by both of these. Continental convergence, you could give the example, elaborate example of the Himalayas. You could give the example of the Alpine ranges. You could give the example of the Appalachians. They are also basically a result of the continental convergence overall. So like that, you have to talk about the views on mountain building. So here what you could introduce in a very specific manner is that views of mountain building or the theories of mountain building are broadly classified into various types, from contractionist theory to the movement theory, like that, or the drift theory associated. So just for the name's sake, mention that it was given by the contractionist theory provided by Colbert, then for example radioactive theory provided by Holmes. So like that, you could just mention the examples, the names of it, and then eventually come to the fact that most reliable explanation for the formation of mountains is provided by the plate tectonic theory. Plate tectonic theory postulated by the theories provided by Mackenzie, Morgan, Parker, Wilson, all of that you can mention there. And then the world mountains on the basis of their genesis. So here you can give or use the world map, very rough world map if you want, and talk about the examples. So block mountains, Vosges, Vindhyas for example. That is something you can elaborate. Fold mountains example, Andes, Himalayas. Volcanic mountains are also present all across the world, from Kilimanjaro to various different Mount Hood, Mount Shasta, Mount Cotopaxi, various different volcanic mountains, and how plate tectonics ends up justifying that. So it is a 20 marker. As many images and as much description as required would be sufficient in this. Then describe latitudinal distribution of Köppen's classification of world climate. Now this is also a straightforward, a simple question. So here, what do you need to do? The classification. So here, on the basis of the latitudinal distribution of the region, first of all, how do you introduce this? You talk about the fact that Köppen's classification was driven from the idea about the distribution of vegetation, right? Distribution of vegetation. So again, the aspect of environmental determinism. So that also could be highlighted in the answer. That will also indicate to the evaluator that you are able to interrelate and interconnect different topics altogether. So this was dependent on environmental determinism, right? So here, on the basis of classification of vegetation. Now classification of vegetation, which was relied upon by Köppen, was given by Candolle. So on the basis of the classification provided by Candolle, right? So after that, you can write that here temperature and precipitation those were considered to be the prime factors determining the variation in vegetation from one area to another, and that is what was also eventually used to classify and distribute the climate. So, what is the latitudinal distribution? You can talk about A to E, A, B, C, D, E, and you can also then talk about that the anomalies in areas of higher latitude or in the areas of higher altitude rather, they were indicated by the H type of climate. Then A type, closest to the equator, the region around equator, this was further subclassified into AM, AF and AW, right. Like that, B type in the subtropic region where you have the dry climate. So, there again a broader classification of BW and BS, that is deserts and the steppe or the semi-arid region. Now, these BW into BWH and BWK, BSH and BSK depending upon the temperature. Like that, even C, CFA, CFB, CS, then like that you can go for the classification even for D and EF and ET. So, this is where you indicate that starting from the region of equator you have A type, then you move ahead B type, then you move further away from the equator, you have C type closer to the coastal areas. In the interior areas and further higher up you have the cold snow forest type, that is the D type, and then further the polar region or the polar type of climate, that is E type, classified into tundra and ice caps. So, that is how you could classify. It is the introduction that you would provide all the details about how this Köppen classification was driven from, and also the factor of how environment would, the factor of vegetation was used as a reverse mechanism. Ideally, environmental determinism is what? The amount of rainfall will end up determining the type of vegetation that you have, isn't it? That is what the determinism is. But here the reverse of that was utilized, right. So, the reverse of determinism was utilized by Köppen. Then, with suitable sketches, elaborate the bottom topography of the Indian Ocean. Again, a very simple, straightforward question. Almost every year, UPSC does ask you a question associated with bottom relief feature. Now, for the past few years, the bottom relief of Atlantic was focused upon. So, Indian Ocean was something which was expected on the expected lines, given the fact that the mineral exploration in the Indian Ocean, given the fact that various different archipelagos in the Indian Ocean have been in news. So, this was on the expected parameter. You would have to provide a basic schematic image of areas such as the Socotra Ridge, the Chagos Ridge, Carlsberg Ridge, etc. And here, what you classify here further is when you write the answer, when you elaborate the answer, you have to talk about the regions of the margins, continental margins. So, when you talk about the continental margins, here further elaboration into the aspect of shelf, slope, the canyons. Here you can give the example of the submarine canyons that are present, for example, in the margins of the Indian Ocean. Even for example, when you consider the region around river Godavari, then for example, river Ganga, even in the case of river Indus, there you have these presence of the submarine canyons also, right. Then continental rise, examples of canyons, of submarine canyons. Then after that, the ocean basins that you have, the ridges, okay, all that could be written. So, very much again on the expected lines, again significantly covered in the sessions also, and with the questions also, with the help of the PYQs also, you would not face any difficulty in solving this question. So, this is a question which definitely needed to be attempted. Then after that, explain air masses and associated weather dynamics. So, definition of air mass is a must, first of all, when you start with that, and the impact on the weather associated with the air mass. That is the first part of the question. Second is, how do air masses influence weather conditions of the northern hemisphere? Now, this is where this year, for example, you had substantial amount of news headlines associated with nor'easters in the region of US, right, eastern part of US. Now, we had done a detailed video with regards to that in the geographer series on our YouTube channel. You can refer to that as well. So, basically, when we talk about the air masses, these are homogeneous masses of air having a large aerial coverage, which talks about or which has got a unique property of temperature, density, also the aspect of pressure and moisture content. Now, they gain the property from the source region. Very briefly, you mentioned that. Now, associated weather dynamics. Now, these air masses are first of all broadly divided into maritime and continental. Okay. That is the broader classification. Now, what is the influence? So, maritime air masses, for example, can suddenly bring about precipitation, can cause a moderating influence on the temperature of an area. Then the air masses are also classified on the basis of from which area do they come from. So, with the help of advection, the process of advection, they influence the weather condition of a region, right. So, for example, when we talk about a polar air mass, now in that the polar air mass, when it crosses over to the lower latitude, then these air masses can cause sub-freezing temperature even in the mid-latitude areas. Then you have the continental air mass bringing over dry conditions for a prolonged period. Now, the weather dynamics associated with them, they can also influence frontogenesis, lead to the creation of storms. Then other than that, they can also end up creating cold waves and heat waves in certain regions. They can also influence. So, here storms and cyclones Then after that, even in the region of, for example, they will influence the jet streams. They can make the jet stream stronger or weaker depending upon the strength of the air masses, depending upon the convergence of these air masses, right. Now, that will have the creation of heat waves in a particular area, creation of anticyclonic condition in a particular region that can further exaggerate the conditions of high pressure or lack of rainfall. So, like that, you could mention. Now, one way of answering this question is, because it is a 20-marker question, one way of answering this is as and when you describe in a world map, basically on a rough globe, when you talk about the air masses, you talk about the continental tropical, maritime polar, then continental polar, then maritime and or rather continental Arctic. So, all that air masses that you indicate in the diagram, there with each and every influence on weather factor and weather characteristics, you can easily mention and talk about the influence in the northern hemisphere. So, here you could talk about, for example, how the polar air mass ventures into the regions of the mid latitudes, creating the sub-freezing temperature. Then, for example, polar air mass interacting with the tropical maritime air mass. Now, that leading to the formation of the storms, nor'easters. Then, even in certain areas, for example, you have the formation of twisters, in particular due to the interaction of these air masses. Then, when we talk about the moist and the warm air mass, now they can even lead to the warm and moist air masses can form the tropical cyclones or hurricanes in the region of the mid latitude or rather lower latitudes rather. So, there you have the multifarious impact and the multifarious different types of interactions of the air masses. So, each of them could be written. Now, here understand, this is also not the first time that UPSC is asking this question. This is a question which has been asked in the GS paper as well. UPSC has asked this previously, that how do air masses impact the microclimate of a particular region. Just the difference that is expected out of you being a appearing for an optional paper is simple, that you have to delve into slightly greater detail about what are the various impact and the regional analysis. For example, in these air masses, when we talk about the presence of onshore winds in the region of Western Europe, the region of Western Europe experiences maritime climate, right? So, as a consequence, they have moderate temperature as compared to the regions across the similar latitudes in the interior areas, for example. So, these factors you have to further elaborate. Formation of nor'easters, right? Then local winds like blizzards, okay? All these factors you have to elaborate upon. So, again a straightforward question, definitely needed to be attempted, a 20 marker question. You had a lot of scope, and here an image diagrammatic representation was required. Then, soil erosion is creeping death. Explaining the statement, suggest various soil conservation measures. Again a very straightforward and a simple GS based question. This is where geography as an optional should not end up creating panic, but should rather be seen as an opportunity, because many of the questions that you see, now you will get an idea that this is not something that you have read particularly only in the optional. You would have covered it otherwise in the study of your GS papers for polity, for IR, for environment, for geography as well. So, that enables you to have a substantial coverage and confidence for the portion of the optional. So, soil erosion is creeping death. What does that mean? That virtually means, or basically it ends up indicating that wherever you have soil erosion, there is a slow and steady decline in the health of the ecosystem of that region, right? Creeping death here refers to slow and steady decline. Steady decline in the health of the ecosystem. So, you explain this statement. How? Because when we talk about soil erosion, what is soil erosion? Removal of the topmost layer of the soil, and the topmost layer of the soil will have the finest particles in terms of the texture, right? In terms of even the fertility, organic matter, everything is present in the top layer. Now, once that top layer is removed by varying factors such as agents of nature like rainfall, then flowing stream bank, then for example wind, any of the factors can lead to soil erosion. But once that happens, the subsoil is exposed. Now, this subsoil has got, right, poorer texture or coarse grains. Then it will also have basically lower fertility. Now, it will have various consequences. Coarse grains mean what? The presence of coarse grains means that ability to retain moisture and also the trapping of air, that becomes poor. So, moisture retention declines. Moisture retention becomes poor. When the moisture retention becomes poor and also combined with low fertility, vegetation does not happen. Natural vegetation is not supported in an area. Now, when you have natural vegetation which is impacted, again the groundwater recharge will be impacted, the flora fauna will be impacted, because this is basically the vegetation is the primary producer, right? And the primary producer, if you remove out of an ecosystem, the ecosystem won't be able to survive. So, slowly and steadily that creates a region of poor life standards and virtually declining quantitative number of life forms that you can think about. So, that is something you have to elaborate. Now, various soil conservation measures is something that also needs to be talked about. So here, what are the various soil conservation measures? Contour bunding, terracing or terrace farming, then cover cropping, where you plant any crop in order to prevent the exposure of the soil to the agents of the nature. Then, for example, mulching, right, like that. Now, each of the factors need to be talked about in slight detail also. You need to mention what are the aspects associated with that, and you can give examples also. For example, terrace farming in the mountainous areas in the region of Himalayas or in the region of southern part of China, they have yielded very positive results. So, those factors could be talked about. Then, another question which was repeated. So, perception, attitude, value and emotion, PAVE, are important components of biodiversity and sustainable environment conservation. Elaborate. Now, here, if you are not intimidated by the term PAVE, if you manage to look through those terms and understand the meaning of it, then this becomes an easy question. So, here, perception. Perception regarding what? How do you view environment and how do you view the aspect of conservation, right? So, sustainable environment conservation. So, our perception with regards to the environment. Now, is environment considered to be a hurdle towards development, or is environment conservation considered to be a part of our well-being and our development? That also defines the attitude we take towards the conservation. Now, you talk about how earlier you had a negative perception with regards to conservatism or conservation mechanism, where, for example, if you had to conserve an area, the immediate measure in the 1950s and the 60s would be that bar any kind of public influence in that region, no public or no normal, even the local population was not allowed to enter into that area. That was a negative connotation and a negative perception for conservation. Now, from that, owing to the factors such as UNESCO's Man and Biosphere programs, etc., we have gone for a positive perception. And that is where the local population is to be made a stakeholder in conservation rather than alienating them, right? So, that is what is also needed to be highlighted. Then, value. What is the value of environment or conservation and biodiversity? When we talk about the biodiversity, a well thriving biodiversity, whether it is seen as an asset or a liability. When we talk about the biodiversity, it helps in promotion of and encouragement of local ecology. That local ecology, if it is benefited, then you will have ecosystem services which can be availed. For example, you will have cleaner availability or cleaner air, cleaner water, water security will be provided, resources will be available, crop produce will be much more. So, there are multifarious benefits associated. Now, if you take a look at this environment purely from exploitative purpose, that, for example, how the Britishers viewed it, when they took a look at the jungles in the region of the Tarai. Now, those jungles were deforested massively at a very quick span and at a very quick pace. Why? In order to make timber available for railway sleepers, in order to make timber available for paper industry. Now, that is where you extract that. That is where your attitude is for exploitation, where you take a look at the value not as an enrichment but for exploitation. So, that will lead to degradation, right? And then the emotion associated with the ecology or the environment, that how it has been basically inherited by us and is an asset and is a heritage that we have inherited. We have to protect it and we have to pass it on to the next generation. So, it is all about the aspect of sustainable conservation and how the preservation of biodiversity can be done. Okay. So, here again, your idea about GS and the availability of certain case studies that you could highlight in various areas, that would be sufficient to create a good answer. So, this is again a question that you should definitely have attempted, because again a very straightforward question and again not very in-depth information was required from it. Then, how is carbon neutrality essential for future environmental conservation? Describe various efforts taken by nations in this regard. Now, carbon neutrality. Now, when we talk about carbon neutrality, again has been in news owing to the Conference of Parties 28 and the commitments made by India from the Panchamrit goals from Conference of Parties 26. So, carbon neutrality is what? The amount of carbon emissions that you carry out, that much amount of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent, that is also sequestered and stored naturally or artificially. That is the aspect of carbon neutrality. So, when we talk about this carbon neutrality, here you have to also mention that Paris Agreement talks about the possibility and the goal of attaining this carbon neutrality by the year 2050. Right. India has set this goal at 2070. So, why it is important for future environmental conservation? It will, the sooner we hit the peak carbon emission and then we attain carbon neutrality, we will be able to control the amount of global warming and the heating which is happening. So, that is very important and relevant here. Various efforts taken by nations in this regard. So, you can mention the Panchamrit goals by India, where we have declared to have almost 500 gigawatt of renewable production, 50% emission by 50% of energy being produced by the renewables, then reduction of carbon intensity in the economy by almost 45%. So, this is something that you can talk about. Then you can talk about the aspect of market mechanism introduced by various different countries, the issuance of carbon tax which has been imposed by China. So, China is one of those countries which has imposed a very stringent carbon tax, that could be mentioned, right. Then after that, you could mention the European Union coming up with CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism is something that the European Union has come up with. So, multifarious examples, but broadly Indian examples is also something that you had to highlight. Panchamrit, then the overall movement towards the cleaner and greener fuel mix. Okay, these factors you need to highlight there. So, again an easy question. Then, what is a Yazoo stream? Why are Yazoo basins the areas of repeated flooding? Give examples of Yazoo streams or areas from various parts of the world. So, here when we talk about Yazoo streams, now this was one of the many of the students faced difficulty in this. Now, Yazoo is a kind of a tributary of river Mississippi from where the name has been derived from. So, what are the Yazoo streams? These are those streams which run parallel to any particular river channel, right, and they end up meeting that river channel after a very long time or after a larger space. So, here this particular stream, this is, let us suppose, the main river and this is the stream or a tributary. Now, here these are basically separated, they run parallel for a long distance, they are separated by the natural levees. Okay. Now, natural levees are created out of sedimentary deposits, isn't it? Sedimentary deposits. Now, why are these regions very prone to flooding? Because unlike many of the areas where you will see these parallel streams being separated by ridges or mountains, here the separation is by sedimentary deposits. So, any fluctuation in the flow, excessive meandering or sudden increase in the water availability can lead to the erosion and can suddenly lead to further flooding of that region, right? You can have water from both these streams flooding that region mostly because they run parallel to each other. They will be influenced by similar climatic conditions or characteristics. There is not much great distance in between them. So, example, you can give the name of the Yazoo stream with Mississippi itself, or you can give the example of Tons and river Ganga. So, those examples could be highlighted about these Yazoo streams. Then, the latitudinal gradient in species richness is an important geographic trend in biodiversity. Examine the statement. So, basically, this talks about the declining species the biodiversity's richness. It declines as you move away from the tropics. You will have the greatest amount of species richness where? In the region of the tropics. Now, there are two factors associated with that. So, most of the students have concentrated only on the factor of insolation. So, why is it that the species richness is greater in the region of the tropics? First of all, is the factor of greater amount of insolation. That is the main factor, greater insolation. When you have a higher amount of insolation, that means the rate of photosynthesis is higher and overall the net primary productivity of an ecosystem is also higher. It is greater. Okay? That is one factor. Now, when you have the producing community in abundance, automatically the consumers or the biodiversity will also indicate substantial richness. Other than that, tropics indicate and have indicated a kind of a climatic stability for the past few million years or for the past few 100,000 years rather. So, there you have the factor of stability. What do I mean by that? For example, when you consider the regions of the higher latitude, those higher latitudes, every time that the planet goes through an ice age, the higher latitude freezes up. So, when the higher latitude freezes up, the productivity immediately declines and as a consequence, there is a mass migration of the species or extinction which happens. In the region of the tropics, for a long time, even during ice ages, you do not have the exact freezing of the tropics. So, there is almost a consistency of producer community. As a consequence, what happens? Wherever you have consistent conditions or predictable conditions, speciation as a factor is always encouraged. You will have greater number of species to be found in that region. So, that is where you will have greater biodiversity in the tropics. In the higher latitudes, productivity is less and hence the richness will also be lesser. Now, coming to section B. Now, again that was about species diversity. We have discussed it in the environment class also, in the environment GS class also. So, those of you who have attended it won't have faced difficulty. Now, coming to the section B. Critically examine the significance of behavioral approach in the development of human geography. Now, again a part of the PYQ. Now, this was again very much on the expected lines which was asked. So, when we talk about the behavioral approach, now here behavioral approach brought about a significant change in the mid 1900s in our understanding of human geography. Now, this behavioral approach was a reaction or overall a consequence of the quantitative revolution that was experienced in the realm of geography. Now, this brought about the concept. Earlier, what was the case? You had too much of empiricism, right, or too much of quantitative aspect, that for example, in any particular area, whatever would be the conditions of the landscape, it would be understood that human factors would always be a direct sum product of that, right. So, it would be a kind of a very subjective analysis that okay, in a region where you have cold conditions, a particular trend of human activity would be observed, a particular trend of human behavior would be observed. But when behavioral approach developed, That is when you had an in-depth understanding that you can have varying approaches as well. So here, one of the contributions of behavioral approach was that when we talk about the human actions, now these human actions, it was understood, it was dependent on individual choices also, it was dependent on the local environment, the individual experiences or collective experience associated with any particular region, right? Then subjective perceptions, how people perceive that region, subjective perceptions, and choices, right? So that is what was focused upon. Then it also basically led to a departure from spatial determinism. As I told you earlier, based on the characteristics of the space, human actions were automatically thought about. So departure from spatial determinism, from spatial determinism, okay, where human behavior was considered to be a driving force. So human geography was given a different paradigm altogether. Micro level analysis was arrived at. Level analysis was arrived at, right? So these are some of the contributions. Negative, because it is critically examined, you have to mention both positive and negative. So while this helped understand human geography to a greater level, the negative or the criticism that can be associated is that it was unable to identify a macro trend or a larger trend with regards to the human behavior, and the human geography could not be developed at a level of a macro trend or a macro trend analysis, something that was postulated or aimed by Humboldt. Now that is something that could not be developed. So you have to provide that criticism as well. So criticism, lack of macro trend development. Trend development. Okay. So again, PYQ, if you would have seen, you would have been able to solve this question without much of an issue. But again, something that can be covered in the class, or would have definitely been covered in whichever class, whichever area that you are studying from, it would have been covered there as well. While scarcity of water resources are felt locally, but its causes are increasingly global. This is about, in simple terms, what are the global causes which leads to water scarcity? That is the question. Now, what are the global causes? You have climate change induced causes. Climate change induced causes. So you have increased occurrence of droughts, heat waves, and heat waves, they occur. Then you have factors of El Nino or Enzo cycles. Then after that, you have the influence on jet streams, right? All these factors you can talk about. That basically the water resources. Why do we have scarcity of water resources? Because of lack of or the disruption in the hydrological cycle, right? So here you can also talk about changing land use patterns, deforestation. So those factors have to be highlighted. Okay. Now, again, not a very complicated question. CBDs are in decline as the economic core of metropolitan cities, critically examined. So central business districts that the metropolitan cities would have, now you don't have those CBDs being that prominent anymore. Why is that? Because with the expansion of the cities, now you will find the case that as the cities are expanding, you will have multiple different business units in various different areas, driving the growth and driving the occupational requirements rather than having one central business district. So here you can give the example of Delhi NCR, where you have multiple such business centers which are developing rather than only having the model of a Connaught Place driven development. So that example that you can give, then you can give the example of Mumbai metropolitan area as well. In local area or in within the country also, you can give multiple examples thereby. Now critically examine. So in many of the metropolitan areas across the world, you still have the concept of CBD driving the development. And here you can take the case or example such as Singapore. Now in Singapore, you will have the concept of CBD which is still very prominent. You can take the cities such as Melbourne. Melbourne is again one of those cities where the CBD is very prominent, right? So while you will have examples, now first of all you have to talk about the fact that yes, this statement is correct and the CBDs are in decline because of the expansion of the urban population, expansion of the urban areas, the CBDs are in decline, but then in certain areas they are still relevant and they still hold intact. Okay? Then there is a need for gender sensitive regional development. Elaborate. Now here again a very generic question. When we talk about regional development, basically, now that regional development has got various different parameters associated with it. Now when you have the development which ensures women participation and women empowerment as well, right? So how do you have gender specific regional development? So for example, in any particular area, you ensure for you can have rural areas, you can have urban areas. In urban areas, greater women workforce participation can be ensured. In rural areas, for example, you can also have availability of water supply. For example, you have the Har Ghar Jal Yojana. Now, when you carry it out, that automatically brings about a kind of women empowerment. Then, for example, clean fuel, availability of clean fuel in a region, then availability of working environment, safe conditions of working environment, all those factors, they make the regional development much more sustained and long lasting. Okay? So that is what was required to be written in the answer. Explain the theoretical framework and stages of economic growth proposed by Rostov's model. Now, Rostov's growth model basically talks about the development in 5 various different stages. It talks about the fact that all the various different countries, all the various different regions have necessarily gone through those 5 various different developmental stages. That is what was required to be elaborated with examples, right? A straight, direct question and from models of geography. So here the 5 stages needed to be mentioned. What were the 5 stages? You basically had a traditional stage where traditional values are basically given greater importance. Then in this traditional stage, the society is more agrarian. Technological development is not very much. Rural percentage of population is much higher, right? Then after that, you have preconditions to take off, right? Or what is also known as the transitional stage. Where expansion of investment, communication systems, infrastructure development, these factors are focused upon. Then after that, you basically have the takeoff stage, where you have rapid industrialization, greater investment, heavy industries they develop, more job creations happen in general. So those factors, they become very prime driving forces in the economic growth model. So here you could ideally give the example of various countries like US in the 19th century, the regions of Europe, many portions of Europe, Britain, for example, during the Industrial Revolution, right? So various different China, for example, you could give the example of China in the 80s and the 90s, all the way till early 2000s, 90s and early 2000s. Then after that, drive to maturity, drive to maturity. So when you have the drive to maturity, per capita income increases. Okay, so that is where the social life standards become better. Then after that, high consumption, high consumption. So here, because of rising per capita income, you have the diversification into services sector, more services sector grow, and that is where you have the eventual economic growth being driven from. Okay, so that is the stages of economic growth that can be talked about by the Rostov's model with elaborate examples. Then the urbanization process is particularly pronounced in Asia and Africa, where too many urban residents grapple with extreme poverty, exclusion, vulnerability, and marginalization. Now, in the region of Asia and Africa, that is in the underdeveloped and the developing world, you have the problem of, or the problem associated with urbanization. That is the basic crux of the question. What are the problems associated with urbanization in the region of Asia and Africa? And you have to discuss those problems on the line of economic aspect, social aspect, and also the overall socio-cultural aspect. So here, what do you need to talk about? First of all, in the region, so here you have to talk about the urbanization process in Asia and Africa. What does that involve? Greater migration of the population from rural to urban areas owing to the economic factors which drive the population to the urban regions. So that is something that you have to talk about, right? Now, when the urban or when the migrant population moves towards these urban areas, then due to lack of affordable housing, many of them are pushed to the margins of the urban setup or in the regions associated with the river floodplains, etc. Now there the conditions of life are not good. The availability of basic infrastructure is not good. There you will have various associated problems, and also impact or vulnerability owing to climate change is also very high. Majority of the migrants, they settle down in the region of the floodplains. So owing to climate change, whenever you have the river water fluctuating, that is when that population gets impacted. Now then, due to the lack of affordable housing or due to lack of enough job opportunities. Why don't you have enough job opportunities? Because of oversupply of labor. So when you have oversupply of labor, for the same job you have more number of population, then the average living wage also goes down. And due to that factor, you have the problem associated with, let's suppose, individuals being unable to avail proper healthcare facilities, individuals being unable to send their kids to proper education attainment. So there are various associated problems linked with that. So that is a major issue. Then exclusion, because they settle down in the fringes, they are not a part of the city's decision making process. Many of them do not have the voting rights also in these urban areas because they are not the permanent settlers in that region. They settle down in the shanties and the slums. Vulnerability owing to climate change, vulnerability owing to economic discrimination, and then marginalization. That is how you talk about. Give the example of any of the metropolitan region in our country. That will also help you substantiate that, okay, and talk about that what can be the solution or the way forward, because it is a 20-marker question. Urban planning, development of fast modes of transportation so that urban areas are not overburdened. Then the urban region, because there is overcrowding, there is a lot of pollution problem also, which creates the problem or which creates the impact on the health factor of these settlers. So their management of waste, all these as a way forward could be mentioned. Then explain how the physical views of geographical space has basically impacted the forms of spatial analysis. Physical view of the geographical space has impacted how we analyze any particular region, right? That is the decluttered aspect of it. So, here again, when you would have read that in the sessions or whichever classes you would have attended, this is something which is a normal coverage of the sessions or the classes also. This is from the basic books that you would have read through. So, here physical view of geographical space. What is that physical view of the geographical space? So, by physical view, we basically mean the location of a region. Right, the locational aspect of a particular region, the topography of a particular region, the physical determining factors of a particular region, right. So, when you have that physical view of a particular area, that is substantially helpful in understanding the various interrelations and correlations from one region to another. So, here terrain or topography, location, factors of distance, etc. Now, how has that helped in the spatial analysis? It has helped us develop models such as the central place theory, right. It has helped us develop the models for agricultural system, agricultural growth in certain regions. That has also been helped. Now, thereby this physical view has helped us understand the correlation for the trading patterns, the patterns of urbanization which has happened in a particular area. So, those factors have been initiated by that. Okay? Now, explain the heartland theory with reference to the contemporary geopolitical scenario of the world. Now, heartland theory was provided by Mackinder, right? Now, this heartland theory talks about the region of Eurasia, isn't it? It talks about the region of Eurasia as a pivot. And it talks about that whosoever controls that Eurasian region, because Eurasian region is so particularly important and rich in mineral resources, that power will have its influence across the globe. Now, it is also criticized owing to the fact that it is very old kind of a world view. It does not take a multipolar world view, but nonetheless, UPSC is not asking you that critical analysis. It is simply telling you, explain the heartland theory. So, Eurasia and the control of Eurasia, importance of naval power, importance of naval power, okay. Now, contemporary geopolitical example, take the case of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, that was initiated because of the fact that the NATO wanted to have the entire region of Eurasia under its own particular control, whereas Russia was also competing for the same space owing to agrarian aspect, and also the Crimean annexation which was carried out by Russia. Now, why was Crimea annexed? Now, Crimea was annexed because there you have the Black Sea fleet of the Russian Navy, which is very powerful, that is headquartered at Sevastopol. So, there the naval power and the exertion or projection of naval power from the Black Sea fleet into even the region of West Asia was made possible. So, these are some of the factors in the contemporary geopolitical scenario. It is about the control of Eurasia. Had it been a 20-marker question, then you could have provided criticism associated with it as well. But it is only a 15-marker question, so that much is not required. What is that heartland theory? What is the context of Eurasia as a pivot? Because of its resource richness, okay, that is something you have to focus upon. Then explain the basis of Whittlesey's classification of agricultural regions of the world. Now, this was slightly difficult if you have not covered in the class, and you have basically, for example, you have the book by Knowles, there you can find these. But Whittlesey's classification, so classification of agricultural regions is not asked. Whittlesey, what he did, he talked about the agricultural regions as areas of homogeneous property Now, he divided the world into various 12 different agricultural regions based upon nomadic farming, intensive subsistence, etc. Now, what was the basis of it? The basis of classification was broadly classified into environmental, economical, and cultural. So, under environmental, the aspect of climate, topography and soil, right, water availability, water. Under economic, the factor that whether it is for the aspect of oriented towards market or not. Under cultural, for example, whether you have the subsistence cultivation or commercial cultivation. Based upon that, you had the classification. So, those needed to be discussed, and briefly you could also talk about that in certain cultural areas there is not the aspect of much surplus. For example, in the tribal areas you do not have the commercial overview of the of agriculture, it is for self consumption. So, there the pattern of cultivation in itself is going to be very different, the trends of cultivation itself is going to be very different. So, it is not asking you about the Whittlesey's classification, that if you know, you can provide those 12 classifications: intensive subsistence cultivation, commercial, ranching, then for example nomadic, all that you can provide. But other than that, the basis was asked. So, orientation towards market, subsistence or commercial, this is what needed to be emphasized. Okay. Then, what is transnationalism? Why has the scale and scope of transnational linkages of diaspora multiplied in recent times? So, transnationalism, what is it? It is basically the fact that when you are living in a particular country, but you have belongingness or you belong from someone else and you have your sentiments associated with some other country, that is transnationalism, right? Now, this is where you have the modern day concept of a global citizen, where you basically associate your sentiments with global interest and global causes. So, why has the scale and scope of transnational linkages of diaspora multiplied in the recent times? Why has the diaspora multiplied the scope of transnational linkages? Now, this is where you can give the example of the increased communication systems, increased awareness about global issues, which was earlier not the case. Then increased influence of the public opinion also. The voicing of public opinion has become much more important now. Now, increased participation in decision making process has happened. Now, that is where you also have in the modern era of technology, amplification of global issues in various different parts of the world, right? So, those are the various aspects why the scale and the scope has increased, but also the fact that diaspora population has also been increasing or has also multiplied quite significantly. The diaspora is no longer restricted to a particular region. It has spread across the world. So, that is what also you can talk about India's outreach program to the diaspora, which has been carried out. So, those factors you could talk about in this. Okay. Now, assess the criteria required for selecting regions for developmental planning. Again, developmental planning and the regions, a part of the PYQ trend and the theme that UPSC has been concentrating upon. So, what are the criteria? Ideally, the region should not be too big or too small, too big or too small should not be there, right? This factor should not be there. Then other than that, they should have a unique cultural binding factor, right, bringing towards an integration in that area. Some amount of resource availability should be there. Then nowadays you also have the region experiencing the similar vulnerabilities owing to climate change. The region having similar kind of agro-ecological condition or spatial conditions are similar. So those are the factors that can be used for selecting regions. Now here you have to bring about the concept of environment also, the concept of the factor of the changing environment, the changing climate. So various different, for example, the regions in the hill areas, they are being treated differently. So those factors need to be analyzed. Okay. Now what is complementary region? With the reference to hierarchy of settlements, describe the different types of complementary region as proposed by Christoller. A straightforward direct question, what is a complementary region? So it is basically the Christoller central place theory, which talks about that the surrounding areas which support the particular region and its growth. So it provides manpower, it provides labor, it provides the availability of market as well, and that leads to the development of the central region. So that is the complementary region that you can talk about. Now hierarchy of settlements, here what did you have to write? You have to talk about, for example, the complementary regions are dependent on what? So those two factors you have to talk about. One is the threshold and the other factor is the range. Threshold, that is the population required to support a particular business or service. Range is basically what people are basically ready to travel, how much people are ready to travel from one region to another in order to reach one region to another. That is basically the range. That describes the complementary region. If a region is very far away, people won't travel to that region at all, right? Now here you had to talk about the basic classification K3, K4, K7. So K3 represents a kind of the market where a particular central place can support 3 small sub-towns, etc. So that is K3. K5 would end up supporting a much greater transformation. So K3 equal to 3 for market, K equal to 5 for transport principle, and then K7 where you have the administrative setup. Administrative setup. Okay. So that was required to be highlighted. So that is the aspect which you could write. Analyze the spatial changes and emerging patterns of semiconductor manufacturing in the world. So when we talk about semiconductor manufacturing, here, where are the semiconductor industries traditionally located? They are typically to be located in the region of South Korea, they are in the region of Taiwan, in the region of China, in the region of Singapore. That is where they are traditionally located. But there are spatial changes, right? So in many parts, for example, US is investing quite significantly in the semiconductor industry. India is investing significantly in semiconductor industry. So why are these spatial changes happening? You have to analyze that. The reason for these spatial changes and the emerging patterns. So they are shifting to newer sectors, but why? Newer areas, why? Because of multiple factors. One of the factor is the supply chain disruption, which was observed during the time of COVID pandemic. It was observed that many goods in the market could not arrive at time because of the disruption in the supply chain, right? So that was a major issue. Then other than that, China dominance of China in the semiconductor industry provides it with a kind of a hegemonic control and hegemonic power when it comes to multiple different devices and also of various technological advancements. Then requirement for the future requirement. any kind of future advancement of technology, any kind of equipment from space tech to simple mobile phone or electronic equipment does require semiconductor. So that is where self-sufficiency is something that the countries are aiming for. So that is something that you can talk about, that why it is changing in India. You can mention that semiconductor plants are coming up in the regions where they are coming up. For example, in Gujarat, in Assam also it has been declared. So all those you can mention. Karnataka is one of those areas, so that you can mention. In developed countries, migration rather than fertility will be the main driver of population dynamics over the next few decades. Examine the statement. In developed countries. In developed countries, the TFR is low, the total fertility rate is low. Most of the developed countries have a total fertility rate which is less than the replacement rate, right? Replacement rate. So as a consequence, now UPSC had asked it in GS also about demographic winter and the aspects associated. So it is on the common theme. So here that will mean there is a kind of a trend of declining population. Declining population. When you have a declining population, in that case, the labor market is then fueled by migration. Right. So that is where migration is happening in majority of the developed countries, which is fulfilling their local requirement. Now this will be the driver of population dynamics. This is true, where you have the immigrant population, which becomes very, in a way, very prominent in terms of decision making, and also they are the ones who are driving the fertility rate in many of these countries. Now here, over the next few decades, will all the countries experience this? Now this is where you have to talk about the both sides of the argument. In many of the Western economies, it has been found that the migrant population is becoming one of the driving factors of the population dynamics. But again, not many countries will have favorable policies towards the migrants. Many of the countries are basically devising their policies in order to dissuade the migrants from coming to that region. So in those countries, the population will continue to experience a kind of a decline. There is also a kind of a cultural asymmetric factor in many of the countries, due to which the migrant population does not go. So that is where you have both sides of the argument and both sides of the coin that you can highlight. It is again overall dealing with the aspect of that how in the developed countries the fertility rate has declined, but it is the migrant population who is fulfilling that requirement, but for how long. Here you can also talk about that in the context of the changing times, India can seize the opportunity to be a global provider of the workforce. That is something which adheres with also the Skill India program and the revamped education policy that adheres with those principles. Okay? Now, coming to paper 2. Now, in paper 2, starting with the portion of map pointing. So, in map pointing, now here the questions were such that if you were very regular with the portion of current affairs, 3 to 4 you could have done, right. So, here Lukaransar, where is it situated? It is basically a playa lake, saline in the region around Bikaner, right, in the region around Bikaner, caused due to erosion. Wind erosion has created this playa lake by the process of deflation. Then Goa, it is a region in the state of Jharkhand, near the Jharkhand-Odisha border, in the region of Chota Nagpur plateau, particularly rich in iron ore reserves. Raidak river, a tributary of Brahmaputra, a very small stream. Between Teesta and Raidak, Shivalik is absent. Shivalik is not present in that region. And this was in news because it had caused flooding in the region, and quite substantial flooding. Ekta Nagar is the changed name of Kevadia in the Narmada district, where you have various national conventions which take place, right? So that is where you have the Sardar Patel statue, also the Statue of Unity is present in Ekta Nagar. So that is Ekta Nagar. Then Chandanwadi, it is situated in the region of Pahalgam. This is where the Amarnath Yatra marks its onset from the region of Chandanwadi. Then Babina, it is a region in Jhansi which is famous for a very large army cantonment area. So that is where Babina is. Then Tatipaka, this is present near Rajamundry in the East Godavari district of Andhra Pradesh, and it was in news owing to the Tatipaka disease, which basically was a kind of a pest infection and infestation which occurred in the coconut plantations and in the palm plantations. That is why it was in news. Along airport in Arunachal Pradesh, Karaikal, Puducherry, and Panna in the region of Madhya Pradesh, very rich in various different minerals and mines of precious stones. Okay. So again, many of them were in current affairs. So from time to time again in the Telegram group, I keep on providing those areas of map marking, map pointing. Do that regularly, and also follow on our YouTube channel. Saturdays every fortnight we come up with the places in news. That will also be beneficial to you. Now, discuss the basis of various explanations for the formation of Shivalik. So, for the formation of Shivalik, you have three different types of explanations, right? And you have to just mention them and talk about them. One is that you have the marine origin of the Shivalik, just like the other ranges of Himalayas. So, marine origin, the upliftment. Okay? This is one of those. Then the other factor is, or the other explanation which is provided, or the other theory which is provided, is the Indo-Brahm theory, which is again not correct, or has been proven to be not very correct. So, Indo-Brahm theory basically talks about this river, Indo-Brahm river, which would drain from the region of the western part of India all the way to the region of the Brahmaputra plains, and that is where water would be accumulated there, and the natural levee of this Indo-Brahm would eventually get folded to form the Shivalik. So, the natural levee of the Indo-Brahm, natural levee of the river. Then the third is alluvial fan theory. Alluvial fan of Himadri and Himachal. This is the accepted theory of rivers coming from Himadri and Himachal. Okay. The river originating from the region of Himadri and the middle and the great Himalayas, they would have created the alluvial fans, and these alluvial fans have been folded. And that is what has formed or led to the formation of Shivaliks. Okay. So, that needs to be highlighted here. Then conservation and breeding centers are important components of the action plan for vulture conservation 2020 to 2025. Why? Now, here you could treat this question as a generic question as well, that for any particular species conservation, breeding centers are important. Here you have to talk about the vulture population, that the vulture population has been declining in India. You also have to talk about the reasons associated. The reasons associated basically are multifarious reasons. The cultural reasons are there, that now you don't have those many towers of silence which earlier used to be the vulture feeding ground, but also Cattle, in many of the cases, they are now properly cremated or buried rather than left out in the open, which was earlier the case. So there is a declining food population. There's fragmentation of habitat because of increasing urbanization. Then also the usage of pesticides like diclofenac that has led to bioaccumulation and biomagnification, due to which there is a neck drooping and a nervous disorder in the vultures, which also impacts the vulture population. Now, breeding centers have been established, vulture restaurants have been established. This vulture restaurant was in news, the recent one being established in Kodarma in Jharkhand, that was in news this year. Now, these vulture restaurants, they serve as the protected or the conservation areas where they get adequate amount of reliable food supply without any particular kind of adulteration, right? And the breeding centers, in order to ensure that there is a genetic variety of vulture which is also sustained and is resilient. Okay. So, here first of all you have to talk about the threats, okay, threats cultural, then urbanization, aspect of urbanization, then cattle, now they are buried or cremated, pesticides, and also you have the anti-inflammatory drugs like diclofenac, drugs like diclofenac. Okay. So, then talk about vulture restaurants. These can be, or these are the conservation centers. Give the example, recently set up vulture restaurant at Kodarma. You have the ones in Punjab as well, Maharashtra as well. Okay. Then talk about the importance of the breeding center to maintain a viable population, Okay. That is something which was required to be mentioned. Northeastern states of India are geopolitically sensitive and strategically significant. Explain. So, here obviously you do not have to write that no, they are not geopolitically sensitive. They are geopolitically sensitive. Why? They are sensitive because they have lot of various different countries bounding them or bordering them. You have China, Myanmar, Bhutan, then you also have Bangladesh, right. So, those are the countries immediately in the border, and that is why the external influence is quite palpable, perceivable, and quite expected as well. So, that is why these are sensitive zones, but strategically significant as well, because of, you can talk about the various different factors of why they are important or significant. Cultural factor, they represent the diversity of the country, they have the very diverse cultural representation there. Then you can talk about the mineral resource of that region, that mineral, it is minerally rich, particularly the fossil fuel, gas, then coal, these are the minerals which are present there. Then very significant in terms of biodiversity as well. They offer a very unique connectivity to the Southeast Asian region and is pivotal for the success of our Act East policy, right. Our entire Act East policy hinges on the Northeastern region and the connectivity that the Northeastern region can have. So, those things you can talk about here. So, here first of all, why geopolitically sensitive? Bordering region or bordering countries. Then you can also talk about the fact that they are actually connected to the rest of India by the very vital and but at the same time very vulnerable and narrow Siliguri corridor, right. So, that makes them more sensitive. Vulnerability, they are vulnerable to external influences like forced migration can happen, arms supply, smuggling, drug supply, right, influences. And then strategic importance, you can talk about look east policy or act east policy now. Act east policy, trade, defense, natural resource, all these factors could be talked about. Okay. Now, institutional factors are playing a dominant role in controlling the agricultural prosperity in India, justify with evidences. So, basically here you had to talk about the factors such as land reforms, right. You had to talk about land reforms, then land reforms have brought in consolidation of the land, Then you have to talk about MSPs, minimum support prices that are provided, that has also brought about significant agricultural prosperity, commercialization, then agricultural subsidies, subsidies to the farm inputs that are provided, irrigational mechanisms which have been provided with the building of canal networks, right? Then command area programs, etc. All that you can talk about that have led to agricultural prosperity. Okay? Then after that, the Indian Space Policy 2023 supports the commercial presence in space. In what ways will it benefit the socio-economic development and security of India? So, here the Indian Space Policy basically talks about more commercial presence, more participation of the private players also in the space sector. So, what will be the socio-economic development associated? Now you will have, for example, geotagging, the proper geospatial mapping which is done, right? You have the proper urban development which can be done, carried out in a much more phased manner, much more planned manner. Mineral resources extraction can be carried out. Climate change and water table can be studied, hydrological cycle can be studied in much greater detail and much greater depth. Then mineral resources, mineral distribution you have talked about. Then also you can talk about the agricultural regions and better agricultural productivity, control of pollution factors, security. You have devoted military satellites now, better monitoring of the bordering areas, better command control sectors, command control centers being developed. So, network centric warfare can be promoted and can be advocated because of that. More resilient the infrastructure for the defense forces, right. So, all those factors again on the GS lines also you can answer. Discuss the process of formation of conurbations in India and describe their problems. So, conurbations are what? A kind of a conglomeration of multiple urban spaces. So, where do the conurbations develop? Across major highways, across major expressways, for example. Here you can give the example of the conurbation happening all the way from the region of Delhi NCR all the way till the region of Chandigarh and beyond. Now, this happens when you have faster modes of transportation and communication in between, right. So, here you have multiple centers developing. The process is what? Multiple centers of urban growth develop across the region of faster modes of transportation, faster modes of connectivity like highways and expressways, and eventually they become a part of a conurbation, right. Now, problems need to be discussed. What are the problems? You have law and order problem, first of all, one of that problem, because multiple states are involved here. So, law and order, maintenance of law and order becomes an issue. Provision of proper facilities like drinking water, electricity, that becomes a problem. Then again, marginalization of sections of society becomes a particular problem. So, these are the various problems. Then the natural environment in that region degrades, various different types of pollution are experienced in that region. So, the quality of life overall also degrades there. Okay. Again, a question which should definitely have been attempted. Then, India has wide-ranging regional disparities in economic development. Explain the patterns, implications and challenges. So, wide-ranging regional disparities in economic development. You can talk about the, first of all, various different areas, hill regions, for example, hill regions, right, and the regions of the plains, that is a region of disparity. Then northeastern region, that is not significantly economically advanced. Then the western part of the India, western and eastern. Okay. Then southern and central, there is a disparity. Okay. Now, pattern you have to explain. What is the pattern here? So, areas where you have lack of proper connectivity, lack of proper infrastructure, then lack of proper skill development, there the geographical isolation is present in many of these areas. There you have a kind of lack of regional development. Institutional factors for agricultural growth has not happened. That has led to disparity between the western and the eastern part of the country. Industrialization has happened in a lopsided manner. So, these are the factors. Implications. What are the implications? Implications are different or marginalization of certain parts of the country. Then the economic disparity or inequality is increasing quite significantly. Then further those areas which are developed, development is further preferring those regions also, or attracted to only those particular areas now. Then you can talk about improved or increased amount of migrations which are happening from the areas which are not developed to the areas which are developed, and that is leading to multiple social challenges, burdening of the urban area, increased urbanization, deterioration of urban resources, deterioration of the urban landscape. These are the challenges. Way forward, multiple growth centers across the country, right? The development of rural areas across the country, development of infrastructure across the country. Because this is a 20 marker, you also have to provide, or you can provide, the way forward as well. Discuss the variations in nature of glaciers in India and the emerging issues due to climate change. 15 marks. Now, this was again something which had been in discussion for the past couple of years. Variations in natures of the glaciers. When we talk about the glaciers in India, these glaciers, overall, what is the classification of glaciers? You have continental glaciers and alpine glaciers. Continental glaciers found in higher latitude, alpine glaciers found in higher altitude. So, we have alpine glaciers which are present. But here you have a variation. For example, the glaciers in the region of Karakoram and the glaciers in the region of Himalayas. Okay. Now, in the region of Karakoram, the glacial ice or the glacial mass is not getting disturbed that much, but it is also increasing in certain cases. Whereas in Himalayas, you have the retreat of glacier. For example, take the case of Gangotri, take the case of Milam. Any glacier that you consider in the Himalayas, it is on the decline, or there is retreat. Now, as a consequence of that, what are the issues associated? Increased occurrence of gloughs, right? Then the hydrological flow of the rivers is getting impacted. Floods are becoming more prominent. Landslides are becoming more common. Mass movement and other factors of landslide, they are becoming more common. Then as the glaciers melt, due to the factor of decreasing albedo, because when the glaciers melt, the albedo of the region decreases. So, it will also accelerate the warming process, accelerate warming due to decreasing albedo. Okay. This is a factor. So, these factors you had to basically discuss in this question. Then domestic tourism in India has immense local resource potential. Again, tourism one of the expected areas and the part of the PYQ also. Discuss the reasons and its various dimensions. So basically, when you have tourism development in any particular region, it holds immense potential for the growth and the development of that area, of that particular region. Because with tourism, there is greater demand which is created, there is creation of more number of jobs which are there, and also there is an associated development which takes place. There is a rootedness of the cultural identity of that region also. Natural heritage of that region is also protected. Better connectivity happens, which brings about better integration with the economic hubs from various different areas. More inter-movement of the people from one part to other creates greater opportunities for the industries, for the service sector, and overall integration in the economic setup, in the economic grid also happens, right? Now, that is where the local resource can be benefited quite substantially. You will have specialized sectors coming into that area, more skilled professionals coming into that area. With that, you will have greater attention, due to which you will have greater demand of land in that area, due to which you will have more settlers in that region, due to which you will have better health facilities coming into that region, better educational facilities coming into that region. So, the local population ends up benefiting. But there are various dimensions. There is a kind of overburdening also which sometimes can happen. Okay? So, those factors needed to be discussed. Migration, another question associated with that, is the reflection of regional disparities, right? What socio-economic and demographic consequences are experienced at the place of origin and the place of destination? Whenever migration happens from a place of origin to a place of destination. So, here you will have certain push factors which are present, push factors, and here you have certain pull factors, right. So, basically it is a reflection of regional disparities in terms of growth, in terms of economic opportunities, in terms of natural resources, in terms of cultural assimilation sometimes, or cultural openness of the society as well, right. These are some things that we have discussed even in the GS classes. So, those of you who have attended the plus courses of geography and environment, you would have seen that many of the questions you would be able to attempt even by the attending of the GS classes for the plus courses that we offer, right. So, that is what I always also would have emphasized in the plus courses, that it is about the interlinkage of various topics which makes you proficient enough. So, that is something that you should hold as a goal, as a ideology, that will go a long way, okay. And revision, more you are able to revise, more interlinkage you are able to do. So, what are the socio-economic and demographic consequences? So, in the region of, let us suppose, place of origin and place of destination. So, in the place of origin, will you have more schools than being built if people are migrating to another place? No. Will you have more job opportunities being created here? No. Will you have better medical facilities being created here? No, because majority of the population is migrating there. Then the sex ratio in this region will be more skewed, because majority of the male population are the ones who end up migrating. Then in the place of destination, it will lead to, one of the case is overburdening, skewed sex ratio, male dominance in general in terms of the sex ratio, improved socio-economic conditions. So, there will be positive as well as negative aspects. So, what will it lead to? Further increased disparity between the place of origin and the place of destination. There will be greater amount of disparity which will be caused. Now, in spite of various tribal area development programs in India, tribal areas still lag behind. Discuss critically with examples. So, you have to talk about the fact that it is not the case that many tribal areas still lag behind. You have the positive outcomes also associated in certain areas around Chhattisgarh, in certain regions around Madhya Pradesh, right, in certain regions around Jharkhand. Now, that is because the tribal area development programs that have yielded positive results. Now, many areas still lag behind. Why? The areas they lag behind because lack of connectivity, they are still very isolated, they don't have proper infrastructure which is still there, which still requires to be given. Then you also have a kind of geographical isolation of many of the tribal areas, for example, in the island regions. Then in many of the tribal areas in the northeast, you also have the factor of cultural factor, where greater assimilation is still not happening. So there are multiple factors due to which some of them lag behind. Connectivity, infrastructure, skill development, facilities for healthcare, education, that is what you have to concentrate. Enough opportunities as a consequence of that is not there. These are the 5 factors that you have to concentrate. Having said that, in certain areas they have been provided. Water scarcity is an important cause of disputes and conflicts in India. Now, this was in news recently owing to the issue of water sharing between Delhi and Haryana. Otherwise, this is perpetually in news in the region around Kaveri River Basin, right? So, it is an important cause of dispute and conflicts in India. That is something that you need to elaborate. Now, why it is because the availability of water in India is mostly restricted to 3 to 4 months of the monsoon season in the country, of the monsoon months in the country. Remaining portion of the year, we do not receive that much adequate amount of rainfall. In the peninsular rivers, you basically have anyways they are mostly rain fed, right? All of them are supplied due to the rain, so there is a greater seasonal variation. In the Himalayan rivers, owing to the unseasonal characteristic and irregular rainfall, there is a scarcity. Unsustainable cultivation carried out, or unsustainable cultivation practices carried out in many of the areas, is further exaggerating the water scarcity. For example, growth of sugarcane and paddy in the region of Punjab and western UP, which is otherwise dry, that further exaggerates the water scarcity, which leads to greater amount of conflict also. Innovative methods. So, innovative methods are what? For example, micro irrigation, right? Watershed management, then rainwater harvesting, right? Then basically suitable crops to be grown in that region, Then after that, industrial use to be charged, responsible use, right? Then you can talk about the creation of more tankages and tank structures, then water metering, all those factors you can talk about in this. Then in section B, how are geographic factors influencing the distribution of high annual rainfall in certain parts of India? So here, what are the geographical factors? So what are the geographical factors that you talk about? One is the topographic factor. So in the case of topographic factor, give the example of the region of northeastern part and also the western Ghats. So in the northeastern part of the country, you have the hills and basically the topography forming a funnel shape, due to which all the various different moisture carrying winds, they get retained in that area, and there is significant amount of rainfall which is caused in that region. So that is a topographic factor. Then other than that, you have the climatological factor also. What are the climatological factor? Here you have the influence of the jet streams. Which are those jet streams? Basically subtropical westerly jet stream, right? The presence and the sudden disappearance of that is responsible for greater amount of rainfall, onset of rainfall, burst in monsoon is associated. Then tropical easterly jet, that is associated with increased rainfall caused in India. Then you have the Somali jet or the Findlater jet, Somali jet. Okay. Then you have monsoonal troughs, if they are very prominent, monsoonal troughs. These are the regions of low pressure. Then cyclonic seasons. In the topographic, also talk about the foothills of the Himalayas, right? Then cyclonic seasons. Other than that, global circulations like Madden-Julian oscillation, positive phase of IOD, because you only have to talk about high rainfall. What causes high rainfall? Then La Nina. Okay, these are the factors which are responsible for sudden increased amount of rainfall and high average amount of rainfall experienced in India. Then you also have the factors like western disturbance. Western disturbance is also responsible. So, all of this could be elaborated easily. Here you have to talk about Western Ghats, Himalayas and northeastern hills, Garo, Khasi, Jayantia, etc. Indian population belongs to large number of races. Discuss the spatial distribution of major races. Why there is a spatial distribution of various different major races. So, here large number of races are there. You basically have, if you consider the races or the racial distribution in India, you have the Negrito, you have the Proto-Australian, then you have the Mongoloid. So, Negrito and Proto-Australian in the region of the islands you have. Then, for example, you have the Mongoloid in the northeastern region, also known as the Sino-Tibetan. So, that is in the northeastern part. Then you have the Indo-Dravidian, which is in the southern part. Then you have Indo-Aryan, which is basically in the central portion. Then you have the Alpine, which is in the hilly areas. So, you have various different races. You could talk about some of the basic features and the spatial distribution. And then after that, you could talk about the reasons why there is spatial distribution, because of how they have migrated, the migration patterns. The migration patterns have largely determined, and also the geographical barriers which existed between different areas have ensured. For example, here you can talk about certain geographical barriers in the region of the hilly areas, then the presence of the Vindhyas, Satpura, etc. These geographical barriers, the islands being very far off, not properly connected, that is something you can talk about. Okay? Then, examine the transitional role of technology in the Indian agricultural sector. Transitional role basically means what? That how technology is able to transition the Indian agricultural sector from the condition of the state that it is in to a better situation. So, that is the transitional role here. So, when we talk about this transitional role of technology, what are the factors that you have to concentrate upon? So, here better satellite mapping, better agricultural practices like irrigational monitoring system, right, tensiometers, etc. Then better weather forecasting with the help of the Doppler radars, right. Then better logistical system. Then after that, better connectivity. So, unification of markets are there. All these factors could be talked about, right. How they are helping transition the technology from the condition that they are in to a better situation. Okay. So, at the production side, then even when we talk about the better variety of seeds, genetically modified seeds, those drought resistant varieties of crops, those factors, high yielding variety of seeds, better mechanization has increased the output in many of the regions. All those factors could be talked about. Then, describe the area specific strategies for the development of drought prone areas in India. So, which are the drought prone areas? You basically have the regions in peninsular India, right? So, peninsular India, you have the various regions. Which are the regions in peninsular India? You basically have the Vidarbha region in Maharashtra, Karnataka, Telangana. These are very drought prone, Andhra Pradesh. Okay. Then in central India, you basically have the regions around central Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Rajasthan, then northeastern Bihar, then after that Himalayas hilly regions, Bundelkhand, northwestern part of India. Okay, all these are drought prone. So, what are the strategies? Climate resilient agriculture, more crop per drop methodology for growing of crops, that is one of the ideas. Then after that, going for better irrigation methodologies, right? So, all those factors could be brought about. Then for example, in those areas providing the, in many of the cases, the solar water pumps also. Then interlinkage of river channels in those areas. So, these are the area specific strategies that you can mention. Then examine the relationship between the seaports and the regional development of India. Now, this is a straightforward simple question. You can give the example of Haldia region, you can give the example of Paradeep, you can give the example of Mumbai, you can give the example of industrial development in Goa, you can give the example of Kamrajar and Ennore in the region of Chennai, so Tamil Nadu. So, that entire example you can give. So, relationship between seaports. So, wherever you will have seaports, there will be more industrialization. Why? Because there will be greater supply of input or raw materials and finished products also. As a consequence, there will be logistical hub development as well. There will be skilled manpower professionals. Then there will be development of also transportation linkages from the hinterlands to that region, which will further lead to the development of that area. Here examples are the crux, and that is what you have to exemplify. Then industrial waste is diversified. Discuss the potential and the challenges associated with the industrial waste. So, what is, when we talk about industrial waste, there are various different types of industrial waste. You have concrete, metal waste, hazardous waste, all that you have to mention here. India generates significant amount of industrial waste across the globe. Now, potentials and challenges. What are the potentials? Potentials, it can give rise to a circular economy, it can create multiple jobs, it can reduce the price of or the input price of many of the products, it can overall create demand in the economy, which will be better for the economic growth, right? But what are the challenges? Majority of the waste is unaccounted for, isn't it? You don't have proper collection mechanism, integrated waste management principles are lacking. Much of the waste is still handled in the unorganized sector, due to which there is health hazard associated, right? Leakages happen, then wildfires, they also occur. Then other than that, you also have the factor associated with greater amount of wastage of the industrial waste. It is not reutilized. It also leads to pollution of the air, pollution of the water. So, those are the straightforward simple factors. How is cultural background of states of India reflected in the attributes of sex and age structure? So, here when you talk about the cultural background, you basically have to talk about systems like, for example, patriarchal setup. Patriarchal setup. Now, wherever you have patriarchal setup, generally you know that there is greater amount of female infanticide and feticide which still happens. So, the sex ratio is skewed, right? Sex ratio is poor. Then after that, you also have the factor that this cultural background, for example, whether there is women participation in the labor force or not, that is directly responsible or attributed to whether the women are able to avail the medical facilities or not, whether they are aware or not. So that ends up influencing the total fertility rate of a region. If the medical facilities, etc., are not well developed, then the total fertility rate is very high. So in that case, you will have what? A kind of the age structure which is very youthful, right? Sex ratio will be very poor. Then wherever you have greater amount of girl child education and equality measures as a cultural backdrop, as a cultural background, in those cases the sex ratio is better. Then you will have a kind of an aged population in certain areas, total fertility rate is less, or there will be bulge in the working age population, the demographic dividend will be there. So like that, you have to discuss about this. Then this was a direct question, discuss the targets of focused interventions of Jal Shakti Abhiyan, Catch the Rain 2024. So this talks about stormwater drains, integrated water management system, greater rainwater harvesting. So in case in this particular question you are not aware of the data pointers, you could ignore this. But if you have studied the scheme in detail, you should attempt this. So here you have to talk about what that Jal Shakti Abhiyan is about. It is about water security, right? Fighting the scourge of climate change and urbanization pressures to provide water security. So here rainwater harvesting is paid attention to, greater water storage and repairing of let's suppose the natural lakes, ponds, aquifers, that needs to be that is something which is provided greater attention to. Sponge city concept is being provided so that there is all the water, rainwater is captured and directly taken to the groundwater. Groundwater recharge will also end up happening. Then India is playing a very significant role in world affairs. Examining the stands taken by India in important global and regional summits. So here, global and regional summits, you have to talk about, for example, G20, then UN, then Convention on Climate Change, then BRICS, then ASEAN, right, SCO. So a question which you could do by studying IR also. Chetan sir would have covered all of this in significant detail also, but this is also a part of the international aspect of geography. So here in G20 and in the aspects of UN also in the case of UNFCCC, India has hoisted the stance of the global south, has amplified the stance of the global south in detail, right? It talked about that the voice of global south needs to be heard, its interest needs to be represented. So that is something which was taken as a dominant factor in ASEAN. It has promoted for free trade and better trade for services. So people to people contact is in general what India has been advocating for. Then SCO, India's fight against terrorism in the region is something which is very prominent and vehement. BRICS, again, representing the regions for developing world's requirement for finances, alternate mechanism for development, that is something that India has been focusing on. So each of these you could diversify what the stance of India has been. For UNFCCC, the aspect of loss and damage fund, the aspect of common but differentiated responsibility, in the case of UN, a reform of the international order, all that separately you could mention. Then 73rd constitution, this was a question from political geography. 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act devolved functions, finances and functionaries for planning of rural areas in India. Discuss the major achievements of the 73rd Constitutional Amendment. So, 73rd Constitutional Amendment brought about the Panchayati Raj institutions, right? Then under it, eventually you also had PESA, extension of panchayat extension of services. So basically you had the gram sabhas which were empowered, so greater say in the decision making process. Now the local bodies became financially empowered by the help of being able to raise their own monies, and with the help of the stamp duties, with the help of property tax, market permits, etc. So they were able to raise their own set of finances as well. Then after that, these local bodies, they were able to voice their opinion with regards to where industrialization should happen, what should be the role, or whether there should be the local community hospitals which should be developed. So they became a partner or a stakeholder in their own development, and even in environmental conservation processes like mining, the local bodies have achieved significantly. How do small and fragmented land holdings affect the agroecological system in rural India? What are the resilient steps needed to overcome this issue? Fragmented land holdings, how do they affect the agroecological system? Majority of the farmlands in our country, farmers in our country, belong to either the category of being small or marginal, isn't it? Majority of the farmers are either small or they are marginal. Now almost 86.7% to be precise. Now how does it impact the agroecology? They have reduced production, due to which they apply greater amount of fertilizers, due to which, and pesticides, due to which there is impoverishment of the soil fertility and the soil health and the soil quality also. And also the ecological system overall, that there is a greater extraction of water, over intensive utilization of water, due to which there is depletion of the hydrological cycle in that region also. Then the biotic resources of that area, microflora, microfauna, they are also killed by the excessive application of the chemicals. Resilient steps: land consolidation, consolidation of land. Then after that, farm produce organization, FPOs, development of cooperatives, market reforms, right? And also one innovative measure that you could talk about is development of alternate avenues like mixed farming. Mixed farming, that is animal husbandry also, if it is promoted, that would also alleviate the problems that the farmers face. So mixed farming methodologies. Okay. Now, how can morphology of Indian towns be described historically? So this is basically the various different areas. So pilgrimage towns that you had, then you also had the defense towns which were built during the British times. Then you had administrative towns, fortified towns which were earlier built during the time of the Mughals, temple towns which were earlier built before that and during the Middle Ages also. So like that you can talk about. For example, during the time of the Mughals, you had everything or almost the entire township within the forts, fortified setup, right? Then you, before that, you had the pilgrimage centers around which the settlements happened. For example, Varanasi. Then you had the coastal towns which also developed on the basis of trade. So it was also kind of a linear development there. Discuss the major features of the first planned city in India. So here you have to discuss the features of Chandigarh. So Chandigarh, you basically have to discuss that how it talks about access to common facilities, then the classification of the various transportation systems from national highways to the pathways to the footpaths, all of them, proper demarcated sectors, availability of facilities in each of the sectoral areas so that you don't have any amount of overcrowding, separate modern architecture based administrative centers in separate part of the town. So that is the feature of the first planned city. Health is the outcome of interaction. Now this is also a good question between physical setting, cultural traits and ecological connection. Explain. So where basically you live, in which area do you live? So physical setting is will end up determining the kind of, let's suppose, connectivity features that you have, the provision of connectivity features from one area. So access to health resources, right? Then also physical setting will end up influencing the climate of the region. That will also have the impact on the health, right? Then physical setting, as it is influencing the climate, will also end up influencing the kinds of diseases that one is prone to. For example, in a marshy area, in a muddy area, or in the region of very high rainfall, you will have greater onset of diseases like dengue, malaria, etc. Then cultural setting, the cultural traits, the nutrition source that you are having, lack of animal protein in certain cases, or restriction of diet only to a certain because of the aspect of geographical connectivity, or in many of the cases development of certain antibodies within the body. Then in certain cases, for example, in many parts of tribal India, you have the development of sickle cell anemia. That is owing to the kind of deficiency that many parts of the population have because of the cultural aspect of their dietary habits, and also the ecological, the environment that you are exposed to. In the majority of the parts of northern India, it is now declared fact that, for example, the exposure to pollution is much greater a danger as compared to, let's suppose, smoking in general or industrial contamination. So that is where the environment, the clean water, the clean air that you are exposed to, all these factors end up influencing the health of an individual. Okay? Then, what are the major regional rapid transit systems developed in India? How are urban problems being addressed by them? Now, this is also a simple question that we have discussed even in the GS classes. So, regional rapid transit systems. So, you have various of them. For example, you have metros, metro rail, then you have expressways and highways, then you have the proper RRTS system, suburban railways, urban railways, right. So, what are the urban problems being addressed by them? So, when you develop these transit systems, then overall there is reduced burden on the urban population or on the urban area. The urban resources are sustainably managed and maintained, lesser pollution. Population is more distributed, right? There is a greater, so all the aspects of marginalization, etc., that you would have discussed, that goes out of the window. And then greater empowerment, better socio-economic conditions, better wage of the larger population also. Okay? So, this is what you have to discuss. That marks the end of the questions. I hope the session has helped you understand what to concentrate upon and how you could have created the answer and enriched the answer at the same time. If you have liked the video, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. But at the end of it, let me also emphasize that all or majority of the questions that you find here, while it might seem complicated to the untrained eyes, but whichever coaching institution that you are a part of, I am sure they would have covered this, or if you are a part of our geography optional portion, you would have covered all of this and you will cover all of this. But even those who are still only covering the GS, those of you who have been a part of our GS courses, and you are thinking of geography as an optional, you would have been encouraged taking a look at the questions and how to address the questions, because your preparation for GS would also shape your preparation for the portion of optional. So having said that, I hope this has added to your knowledge content, and for all the aspirants appearing for the examination for future, this is something that you can extract most out of. Till we meet again, take care, goodbye, and thank you.